afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the ISAS webinar titled Sri Lanka Elects a New President, What is Next? Anura Kumara Dissanayake, Sri Lanka's new president-elect, has formed a new and smaller cabinet of 3 ministers on the 24th of September. This webinar will explore the dynamics of the presidential elections and the economic, social, and political implications for Sri Lanka. To speak on this today, we're delighted to have with us our expert panel, beginning with Ms. Subhashini Abesing, the economist and research director at the Verite Research Institute, Dr. Delaney, the senior lecturer at the Department of Commercial Law, University of Colombo, and lastly, we have our in-house Sri Lanka expert, Dr. Rajni Kamachi, who is also a research fellow at ISAS. This session will be chaired by Dr. Ronojoy Sen. He is a senior research fellow as well as the research lead of politics, governance, and society at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I shall now invite Dr. Ronojoy to start the session. Dr. Ronojoy.
Thank you, Kanika, and welcome to today's panel titled Sri Lanka Elects New President, What Next? I'll keep my remarks extremely brief since all of you would really want to hear the real Anura Kumara Dissanayake took office as president of Sri Lanka on September 23rd, promising change in a nation long led by powerful political families, which is emerging also from its worst economic crisis in more than 7 decades. Dissanayake ran as the candidate for the National People's Power, or the NPP alliance, which includes the Janatha Vimukti Peramuna, or the JVP party, that has traditionally championed Marxist economic policies centered on protectionism and state intervention. Popularly known as AKD, Dissanayake polled 1.27 million votes more than the nearest rival and main opposition leader, Sajith Premadasa. Ranil Wickremesinghe finished third. The NPP's rapid ascent, having secured only 3% in the 2019 presidential race, reflects rising anti-establishment sentiment and the growing discontent with the outgoing Wickremesinghe government's reforms in the aftermath of the 2022 economic crisis. Since none of the major candidates, Dissanayake, Wickremesinghe, or Premadasa, secured more than 50% of the vote, Sri Lanka also had its first ever counting of second preferences, resulting in Dissanayake's victory. On 24th September 2024, Dissanayake formed a small cabinet of 3 ministers, with Harini Amarasuriya being appointed Prime Minister. Amarasuriya is the third woman in Sri Lankan history to hold this position. Soon after, Dissanayake dissolved the 225-member parliament and called for snap general elections to be held on 14th November of this year. Dissanayake now faces the task of setting up a new cabinet, the challenges of the upcoming parliamentary elections, and passing a budget under the terms of the 2.9 million USD bailout from the International Monetary Fund. The panelists will explore the presidential election result and its economic, social, and political implications for Sri Lanka. They will also examine the future of the Dissanayake government and the coming parliamentary election in November. So may I now invite Ms. Subhashini Abesing. She will speak from an economic perspective on the IMF bailout, but also on what the expectations of the people are from the new president. Over to you, Subhashini. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So let me start by giving just quick context to the economic and political landscape within which the election took place in September, which is very important for us to understand what is expected by the people from the AKD government, AKD NPP government, and how prepared or how feasible is it for them to deliver or live up to the expectations of the people. So, like it was mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka went through this crisis that is unprecedented, with over 50% of inflation, exchange rate crashing by over 70%, enormous economic suffering, rapid rise in poverty levels, shortage of essential goods. So compared to all of that economic crisis that Sri Lanka went through, at the time the election took place, Sri Lankan economy seems to be in a better place. Inflation has been curtailed to single-digit levels. Exchange rate largely stabilized. Sri Lanka, after recording consecutive quarters of negative growth, turned growth into positive territory since third quarter. And we've completed the debt restructuring, which is critical for debt sustainability. So one wonders why then did the Sri Lankan public reject the Ranil Wickremesinghe government and wanted a difference and selected AKD, which is largely seen as an outsider, which is not from the typical traditional political elite of the country. So it's a lot of people think that it is because Sri Lankan public was discontent with the pain and suffering caused by the economic reforms. I tend to have a different view on this matter. I feel where public discontent and frustration arose is not on the economic reforms per se, but the manner in which the economic reforms were introduced, the credibility and the legitimacy of the reform process, and obvious, clear evidence of the reform process being captured by vested interests. And there is very important but unappreciated part of the IMF program, which goes, because this program goes beyond pure economic reforms and puts a lot of emphasis on governance reforms. So we all know Sri Lanka is the first country that went through a governance diagnostic assessment in Asia. And the governance diagnostic assessment published by the International Monetary Fund clearly recognizes that governance weaknesses and corruption vulnerabilities are macro-critical for Sri Lanka's recovery process. And the ability of Sri Lanka to actually achieve the desired outcomes of the economic reform program depends on it being paying attention and being committed to simultaneously addressing the governance and corruption vulnerabilities. So unfortunately, lack of appreciation within the government and lack of commitment within the government to the governance reform part is one of the reasons why people lost confidence in the Ranil Wickremesinghe government. And I just want to quickly share with you my slides just to show how important this is. Extract from the IMF governance diagnostic. You could clearly see what did the governance diagnostic assessment looked at. There are critical changes into addressing governance weaknesses and corruption vulnerabilities that stand in the way of achieving the economic objectives of the reform program. And that they've seen this as complementary and essential to sustain progress of fiscal consolidation, which is a priority area of the IMF program. And what are their findings? They've clearly identified that there are severe governance weaknesses and corruption vulnerabilities that actually can erode the outcomes, significantly erode the outcomes of the economic reform program. And it is lack of attention to this, not only the lack of commitment to implement this, but also despite recognition of the urgent need to address these, continuation of the existing processes and institutions in the same manner. Take, for example, public investment and public procurement. Two key areas that is clearly identified as having very high levels of corruption vulnerability, critical for public finance management. But during the period the program was implemented, we had multiple procurement scandals unfolding. At the same time, this program is dependent on very ambitious revenue-based fiscal consolidation. So one of the critical problems Sri Lanka faces is very low government revenue. To an extent, Sri Lanka's government revenue crashed to 8% during crisis as a percentage of GDP. This is historically low and one of the lowest in the world. And almost 70% of government revenue is taken up for interest payments. So fixing revenue remains critical for recovery. But what is unfortunate is, again, coming back to the quality of the reforms, at a time where Sri Lankan government increased income taxes as well as consumer-based taxes to raise revenue, the government also took actions that at the same time allowed certain groups and individuals to make money while foregoing massive revenues. So this is again a governance issue. I'll give you one example that is a big scandal that unfolded during this period. As an example, there are many. This is popularly known as a sugar scam. This is where Sri Lankan government changed taxes on import of sugar. We import a lot of sugar, and sugar import taxes are an important source of revenue. Overnight, using a piece of legislation that has been passed in violation of the provisions in the Constitution that demands taxation matters need to have public oversight. This particular act, Special Commodities Act, gives the minister discretion to change taxes overnight without any parliament oversight. And during a time where taxes are being increased and a lot of tax burden is put on people, Sri Lankan government decides to revise these taxes from 50 rupees to 25 cents, leading to almost 2 billion rupees of tax revenue lost every month because of this on average. And this, what is worse is, despite Auditor General pointing this out, despite think tanks and research organizations showing that at a time like this, things like this cannot happen, this continued for over almost 37 months before it was reversed. So it is not the reforms per se, it is the quality of the reforms, the manner in which reforms were introduced that created a lot of frustration within the public. One last point I want to make in terms of reform process, and maybe Dilini can add more to it than that, about the Sri Lanka's lawmaking process. So what you need to understand is economic reforms come in the form of introduction of new laws and amendments to existing laws. But unfortunately, lawmaking process in Sri Lanka is not consultative and not transparent. And public is given a very short window of opportunity to understand these laws that can have lasting impact on wide cross-section of society and challenge it if they are not happy with it. And this kind of process, and especially certain acts such as Online Safety Act that was brought in a hurry, which undermines the rights and freedoms of people, is just one example. So in my way, where AKD capitalized and where AKD saw the opportunity is this public frustration with the governance, with the corruption, with the legitimacy and credibility of the reform process. And this is what, so people will actually expect him to really deliver on that, because this has been a continuing public demand since 2015. One reason why Mahinda Rajapaksa government lost election was people realized high levels of corruption and poor governance as a core problem facing the Sri Lankan economy and society. And the government that came to power at that time, the Ranil Wickremesinghe Maithripala Sirisena coalition, was referred to as good governance government because they campaigned on an agenda of restoring good governance. But people were disappointed because they failed to deliver. Even Gotabaya Rajapaksa, what you need to understand is when he was elected, although the old issues like ethno-nationalism and national security came to the forefront during his election because of Easter Sunday attacks, still corruption remained crucial. And why Gotabaya was selected and elected was he was seen as the least corrupt person within the Rajapaksa family. And he was seen as a person who may be able to arrest corruption. So even during that election, tackling corruption remained a core demand of the public. So this remains a very high expectation from the AKD and PP government, given that Sri Lanka, the public failed multiple times in the previous election to elect governments that took corruption and governance issues seriously and was committed to addressing them, is what led to AKD selection saying, okay, none of these parties delivered, let's try a newcomer. Let's give an opportunity to an outsider and see whether they can deliver. So in my view, when you answer the question, what next? One of the core expectations of the public is how and which AKD will have to meet is curtailing corruption and improving governance. On top of that, the other key issue that shaped and influenced voter decisions is the cost of living. With the crisis, cost of living has increased. Extreme poverty among Sri Lankans have increased by 4 times. Population living below poverty has more than doubled. Today, 1/4 of the population in Sri Lanka lives below poverty. And as a result, there is this desire that, desire to see that their government is keen on really addressing those core concerns of the people in terms of their living standards and cost of living. So these are two things that these two indicators, how well AKD tackled cost of living and poverty, given the massive fiscal constraints he's facing within his government, and how well he delivered on corruption and governance and actually implementing the governance reforms remain critical. It will be critical, and public will judge him on how he delivers on these two fronts. This is just to give you an example of the IMF program, because a lot of people forget about the governance and transparency areas. So what we realize is that Verity Research runs an IMF monitor. It is online, anybody can access it if you go to mantri.lk website. So when we monitor the implementation of IMF commitments of the government, what we realized is actually where there is delay in meeting commitments or not meeting commitments is largely in areas that are related to governance and improving transparency. So I think my time is up. I'll stop there, but I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Shwashini, for laying out the context as well as the challenges before AKD. May I now invite Dr. Dilini Pathirana. She'll be talking about the geopolitics of investment, particularly with regard to China and India. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, everyone. And it is exciting to be a part of this insightful webinar on Sri Lanka elects a new president. What next? So indeed, the question of what next for Sri Lanka after the 2024 presidential election can be analyzed or approached from various perspectives. Among them, I would like to approach this question through the lens of foreign investment, which has significant implications, not only for the economic recovery program currently underway in Sri Lanka, but also for the country's foreign policy and its geopolitical alignments in the new era of governance, started with the election of Anura Kumara Dissanayake, or famously known as AKD, as Sri Lanka's 9th executive president. Before I proceed with my talk, I wish to clarify that the views I share today are exclusively my own and do not represent the official stance of the Faculty of Law or the University of Colombo. So having said that, let me start my talk by recalling that we live in an era where the world's geopolitical landscape is in flux, of course, due to various reasons. In this context, geopolitical motives have become one of the factors that shape foreign investment strategies of some countries because they increasingly use investment to achieve their geopolitical objectives. So in this context, geopolitical motives, in a context where geopolitical motives have become one of the factors that shape foreign investment strategies, the factors that range from domestic political and economic stability to broader international relations have become crucial in shaping foreign investment dynamics across the globe, including Asia. So against this backdrop, I consider Sri Lanka to be a case in point for exploring two main questions. The first one is how have geopolitical motives of global and regional superpowers resulted in promoting or increasing foreign investment in Sri Lanka, particularly in its critical infrastructure? The second question is, what is the role of diplomacy in resolving dispute related to such investment that has become politically sensitive at the country's domestic level? So against this backdrop, I'll emphasize three main points at this moment, which we can, of course, elaborate during the discussion. So let me turn to my first point. My first point is that foreign investment has been critical in Sri Lanka's recent presidential elections, with specific projects becoming politically sensitive or charged. For context, in the 2024 election campaign, the most critical investment project was the Indian multinational Adani's investment in Sri Lanka's Mana Wind Power Plant project, Phase 2. During the campaign, AKD expressly and clearly promised to cancel this project if elected because, in his opinion, the power purchase agreements of this project undermine Sri Lanka's economic interest. And he further highlighted the impact of increased foreign investment in Sri Lanka's energy sector, one of the crucial aspects of national security. Interestingly, AKD's promise to cancel this project recalls two similar campaign promises from past election. The first is in 2015, the presidential candidate Maithripala Sirisena promised to cancel the Colombo Port City project, a direct Chinese investment in Sri Lanka due to its alleged national security and sustainable development concerns. Likewise, in 2019, presidential candidate Gotabaya Rajapaksa promised to reclaim the famous Hambantota port from its lease to a Chinese company, describing this port as an important national asset that should be remain with Sri Lanka. Indeed, it is a lease, but a leasehold is one of the forms in which an investment can be made. So when we consider this promise as whole, they demonstrate how specific Chinese or Indian investment projects in Sri Lanka has become central to the recent presidential election campaigns and how the political sensitivity surrounding them has been used in election campaigns to influence or shapes the public opinion on Sri Lanka's development agenda. So, having explained the role of foreign investment in the recent presidential election campaigns, now I would like to move on to my next point. So, my second point is that the cancelling the Adani's wind power projects, as AKD promised during his election campaigns, would mark a bold shift in Sri Lanka's political culture. So, let me explain why I consider cancelling this project as promised during the election campaign a bold shift in Sri Lanka's political culture. This is mainly because historically, similar promises made in 2015 and 2019 election to cancel controversial Chinese investment projects were not honored once those candidates took office. The Colombo Port City project continued after a temporary suspension, and the Hambantota port lease remained in place after a quick review of the agreement. So, if AKD were to fulfill his promise to cancel the Adani's wind power project in Sri Lanka, it would break this conventional practice of not honoring election promises, particularly those on disputed foreign investment projects that have been used to shape or influence the public opinion during the election campaigns. Moreover, the cancelling this project as promised would signal a significant change in Sri Lanka's political culture by setting an example that campaign promises on politically charged foreign investment in Sri Lanka are respected and fulfilled. This matters because the AKD's presidential campaign has been predominantly based on bringing about a system change, where politicians are accountable to the public in contrast to the traditional political elites. So, in my opinion, the potential cancellation of Adani wind power project will not be in conflict with his election manifesto as well. This is because while it welcoming foreign investment, the manifesto expressly mentioned the need to attract as well as manage foreign investments without hindering Sri Lanka's national security and economic interest. Therefore, if AKD followed through on his promise to cancel the Adani's wind power project, as he mentioned during his election campaign, it will indicate a shift in Sri Lanka's political culture, an essential or key step towards the internal political reforms his administration has promised to implement and bring about. At the same time, it should not be overlooked the fact that this project has been legally challenged before the Sri Lanka Supreme Court by way of fundamental right petitions, alleging that it is a violation of fundamental rights of the petitioners as well as the Sri Lankan citizen. When the matter came up before the court yesterday, the Attorney General informed the court that the new cabinet has decided to reconsider this project. So, having said that, let me move to my next point. So, my third point is that even though this cancellation would mark a shift in Sri Lanka's political culture related to the campaign promises on politically sensitive foreign investment, a potential cancellation of this project would pose significant geopolitical challenges, and perhaps it could impact Sri Lanka's diplomatic relations with India. Of course, this is due to several reasons. The first reason is AKD's political background. So, as frequently highlighted in the international media, after he won the election, he's the leader of the JVP, a political party rooted in the Marxist-Leninist ideology. This factor has already led some to assume AKD as a natural ally of China, given his shared political ideology with China. The second reason is that historically his party JVP maintained a strong anti-Indian sentiment. This factor has also led some to identify AKD as a historical adversary of India. So, in my opinion, these are early assumptions on AKD's relationship with China and India. However, they could contribute to frame a possible cancellation of this Adani's project as a foreign policy issue rather than an economic issue associated with an Indian investment in Sri Lanka. Such a view is furthered by the wider geopolitical considerations associated with the Adani's investment project in Sri Lanka in general. For context, the previous Wickremesinghe administration expressly perceived Adani's project in Sri Lanka as government-to-government kind of deals between India and Sri Lanka. It was further stated that Indian government identified Adani Group to develop Sri Lanka's infrastructure, including this disputed Mana wind power project, which had been allegedly owed to Adani due to the pressure from the Indian government, which is reportedly having close ties with the India Adani Group. So, understandably, these factors would complicate, I would say, any potential cancellation of these wind power projects, making it more of a foreign policy issue than a matter of Sri Lanka's economic interest as perceived by the AKD. Therefore, its cancellation could become a diplomatic issue between India and Sri Lanka if the Indian government views this project's cancellation as a loss to its strategic interest in Sri Lanka, especially in energy sector. So this recalls India's serious concern when the former Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration decided to cancel the decision taken to develop the East Container Terminal development at the Colombo port as a joint venture in which the Adani Group was to be the investor. So repeatedly, India emphasized the need for Sri Lanka to honor its commitment to India and Japan to develop the terminal as a joint venture. So finally, let me conclude my talk by answering the question of what next for Sri Lanka after the 2024 presidential election, approaching it through the lens of foreign investment and taking Adani's wind power project as an example. So as I explained, I believe that cancellation of this project as promised by the AKD during his presidential election campaign is key to mark a shift in Sri Lanka's political culture. Traditional political culture that did not honor or fulfill campaign promises related to politically sensitive foreign investment. However, the wider geopolitical considerations associated with this project could make its cancellation a foreign policy issue rather than a matter of Sri Lanka's economic interest or matter of protection of an Indian investment in Sri Lanka. Therefore, I conclude that bringing about internal political reforms as advocated, while balancing with the complex geopolitical challenges accompanying such reforms has become one of the main challenges before Sri Lanka after electing AKD as the Sri Lanka's new president in the 2024 election. From that, I would like to conclude my talk and will discuss during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilini, for laying out the complex terrain of not just the domestic reforms envisaged, but linking it to the larger geopolitics, especially the relationship with Sri Lanka's relationship with India. May I now turn to ISAS's very own Dr. Rajni Gamage. She will be talking about the political trends in the run-up to the general elections that are scheduled in mid-November. Over to you, Rajni.
Sure. Thank you, Ronojoy. So in my kind of brief observations that I would like to make, just give me a second, on the political trends leading up to the general elections. I have a few slides that I would like to share. I'm assuming you can see this. So I thought to start off my talk, especially taking into account what the previous two speakers said, to very quickly give the listeners a kind of recap of the post-election analysis. I'm sure that almost everyone is familiar with this, but it's kind of important to make sense of the election results of the presidential elections that happened last month, if we are to, of course, make sense of the general elections that are coming up. So three key observations from the election results last month. The first is, of course, this issue of what is the role of ideology, or what was the role of ideology during the presidential elections. On the one hand, there is this, we did observe that ideology did not play a very distinctive role in the presidential elections. And one of the reasons for this was this so-called liberal consensus that was identified in the lead up to the elections, by which is meant that the main three political camps or contenders were largely aligned on the continuation of the IMF program, despite the SJB and AKD saying that they would, of course, renegotiate the IMF for terms more favorable to poorer sections or more vulnerable sections of the population. But there was this consensus on continuing the IMF program. And then also we saw these three camps moving closer to each other in their position in terms of continuing the provincial council system. So on the issue of the ethnic issue. So in highlighting that there was this ideological consensus during the presidential elections, it's also important to then point out some of the distinctions that we did see among these three camps, with, of course, one camp, especially the Wickremesinghe-led camp, leaning more towards the center-right, and the positions or the promises of the NPP and the SJB leading more towards the center-left. And it's important, I think, to even kind of keep a watch out for these kind of smaller ideological distinctions, because then we can help to make sense of the NPP in government, as well as the election campaigning that is now ongoing in the lead up to the general elections. The second kind of post-election analysis that I would like to make here is, of course, the issue of the minority vote. We did see that the winner, AKD, so the NPP, was able to appeal to some sections of the Muslim population. And this was, I think, quite a victory for the NPP, because the Muslim community has been quite traditionally aligned with the more UMP, SJB political camps. But notably during this election, we did see that the Northern Tamil vote is still significantly alienated, as it was in the 2019 elections, and by which we mean that the voter turnout, especially in the north of Sri Lanka, was relatively low, and that the political parties in the north were very fragmented. So the part of the vote went for the SJB and Wickremesinghe. Part of it went for the Tamil common candidate, but then some voters boycotted the elections, as encouraged to do so by the ACTC. And this kind of observation is important, I would argue, because the presidential elections has been kind of one of the key democratic moments when the Northern Tamil communities, especially, or minority communities anyway, are able to significantly shape the national election outcomes in Sri Lanka. And their inability to do so in 2019 and now in 2024, we would argue that it might have implications that go beyond the election cycles of 2024. Could these be fault lines that get intensified going forwards? Can they be causes for future national instability? These are kind of open-ended questions. The third post-election analysis is, of course, the fact that AKD is a minority president. He was not able to secure more than 50% of the vote. This too within a context of low voter turnout in general during this election. And this is important, of course, because it feeds in and factors into the NPP's government's policy actions since September 2023, because it is aware that it still does not have an overwhelming popular mandate, and it would seek to make actions and policies that would help to at least secure a simple majority in the upcoming general elections. During the rest of my talk, I thought I'll just talk about a few more observations or trends that we are observing in the lead up to the general elections. The first of this is the realignment of political parties. Now, in the lead up to the presidential elections, we did see that the political party landscape was getting increasingly fragmented, by which we mean that in Sri Lanka, we had a two main political camps, which in the last election cycle, the traditional parties broke down to give way to new political parties. But in this political election, it was significant even more because even these traditional political parties, there was a lot of fragmentation within them on the one hand. And then significantly, of course, the fact that an outsider or a third political force such as the NPP has now managed to become a key political camp. The NPP, as we know, it has, in contrast to the JVP, which was its predecessor party and is still the main party within the NPP, the NPP has ideologically tried to appeal to a wide spectrum of voters. And in doing so, it has emerged today as a major political camp in terms of a voter base and an ideological stance. And I do not see this as a short-term development or a temporary development, but as this is something quite a paradigmatic shift in Sri Lanka's political party system. And the NPP's kind of increasing popularity in the lead up to the presidential elections post-2022, since economic crisis, and in the growing sense of anti-establishment anger that we felt among the voters. As the NPP keeps consolidating its popularity, we are expecting at least a simple majority, for it to secure a simple majority in the general elections. And of course, depending on that, the NPP's kind of ability to pass certain reforms and such in the future government will be determined. As we try to understand the NPP's kind of limits and challenges, on the other hand, for the general elections, we have we should look at what the opposition parties are doing. And in the opposition kind of party terrain, what we can broadly identify is the emergence of a so-called liberal camp, which broadly includes the runner-up party, the SJB, as well as this coalition or alliance that come under the gas cylinder that during the presidential elections, of course, came under the leadership of Wickremesinghe. Right now, it's not clear who their leader is. And by liberal camp, I'm defining it more in terms of its economic policies, because, of course, this camp also has certain members of the SLPP, the former SLPP government as well. And then we have, on the other hand, the emergence of quite a formidable force, I would argue, of a nationalist camp that is represented by the Sarvajana Balaya on the one hand, and then the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, which is now led by Namal Rajapaksa, who is the son of the former Mahinda Rajapaksa. Both of these camps, despite the kind of fragmented nature of political parties in Sri Lanka, arguably both of these camps are quite powerful and would pose, I think, a powerful challenge to the NPP going forward for a few reasons. The first being, of course, that many of these candidates have a lot of experience in government and they have a lot of experience in politics. So they are keeping the NPP, holding it accountable and such, despite the lack of credibility that many of these members have gone through since 2022. I think that given the experience and such, that they would still play a significant role in challenging the NPP's role going forward. The nationalist camp is also very significant. It does look at the moment as though Sinhala Buddhist nationalist politics and the kind of politics that were associated with the Rajapaksa political camp. At the moment, it does look like these are quite dented or delegitimized in the post-Aragalaya moment. But this camp has a narrative that is very coherent, that has been very ideologically powerful for many decades. And importantly, this camp also has a lot of patronage politics. It has a lot of money behind it. And so these factors, I think, going forward, even though they may be quite small or not formidable at the moment, could gather momentum in the upcoming years. So finally, to this question of implications, and then also a few words on the NPP kind of in government. One of the main implications of the fragmentation and the realignments of political parties as we see it is, of course, that we can expect many of the political camps that come into parliament in the next election cycle to be relatively smaller. And what does this mean for the NPP government? Is that on the one hand, it provides it more opportunities in who it forms alliances with. And that is, of course, in the occasion that the NPP has to form alliances. If the NPP is able to secure a significant majority, it might even not have to do so. As I mentioned before, the opposition is delegitimized, but it has a lot of governance experience and a lot of patronage networks. So it will form a formidable challenge to the NPP. And then something that Subhashini also mentioned, which is that the NPP has a lot of challenges in terms of expectations management. It had this narrative of economic justice, of democratization of the economy, of delivering not just on the anti-corruption grounds, not just in changing a political culture, but also in delivering the economic fruits. And managing these expectations is, of course, going to be a big challenge. In the first 3 weeks of government with the NPP, what we see is that a lot of its actions and policies have been to secure a lot of low-hanging fruits of anti-corruption. And this has included things such as cutting down state wastage, a series of new appointments, making the government more accessible, opening kind of political issues and cases that have been problematic for a long time, such as the lack of justice over the Easter Sunday attacks and many such cases. While all of these are encouraging, there are, of course, the questions at the back of the mind in terms of how much of these new actions would be a structural or a systematic break from the political culture that has persisted in Sri Lanka. And so it's good to keep a close watch on these appointments. How much of these appointments are meritocratic? Would these appointments trigger institutional inertia to the NPP? And would this in turn kind of drive insular decision making within the NPP government? So these are all kind of me just thinking out aloud. Just a few more points in that the NPP government has also promised a new constitution, which would require a 2/3 majority. And again, with this, we can expect, if it is possible, these would be markers of a structural shift. But then on the other hand, the good governance reforms that the NPP has promised to push through, only a simple majority is needed. And so hopefully we can see some of these lower hanging fruits being pushed through first. The question also of what are the challenges for the NPP in pushing through an IMF reforms program. On the one hand, I have heard this argument that being a left center or a center-left political force, that and given the mandate that the NPP has been given by the people, maybe it might have some legitimacy or leeway to implement some of the more difficult reforms. But then on the other hand, the NPP faces the challenge on how does it satisfy the demand of certain groups such as trade unions. Because there's always a trade-off in these reforms. So I'll kind of close off my remarks by asking this question of whether Sri Lanka has reached a democratizing moment at present. And I think that this question maybe can be asked parallel with this question of, has the election of the NPP into government, does it bring about a structural or a paradigmatic shift in how politics and governance is done in Sri Lanka? And I think that certain markers of it are there. The kind of consolidation of certain previously excluded class into governance, But then again, this opens up the question of, will the patron-client systems that have been nurtured by the past political camps, will they be dismantled, or will they be transformed into the emergence of a new patron class? The question of populism is, I think, also something that we need to watch out for in the discourse of the NPP government. So I think a lot of open-ended questions there. I think I'll leave it there for the discussion session.
Thank you, Rajni, for giving an overview of the politics, both in the run-up to the parliamentary elections, but also the other different elements, including the ideology, the populism, the challenges faced by the current government, and so on. Now, so before I move on to the Q&A session, may I encourage members of the audience to send in their questions either through the Q&A mode or to the chat mode, and I'll try and raise as many of those as I can, bring them up with the concerned speakers. So we have I think a couple of questions coming in. Before that, before I go to them, maybe I'll just address a question each to each of the speakers that sort of struck me while I was listening to all of them. So I had a question for Shivashini. So you talked, of course, about corruption, and one of the expectations of the electorate, the voters, is expectations regarding stringent action on corruption. So what kind of measures do you envisage the new government being able to take in the sort of near to short term regarding corruption?
Thank you. So actually, we have what the best AKD government can do is to implement the recommendations already written down in the IMF's governance diagnostic assessment. So this is where I think one need to really be careful, when we see how leaders take up corruption across the world and also Sri Lanka's own past, about sort of, is it showbiz or statecraft, right? Just going after a few large scandals, going after a few people, a lot of drama and a lot of media attention. It is very popular, but that is not the kind of reforms we need to address governance and corruption vulnerabilities. And there is this mundane, not so sensational, not so popular tightening of the nuts and bolts that, foundational changes that needs to be done. So the hope is that AKD, at least the expectation is AKD will be able to manage that fine balance. You need to do this popular stuff, but you also need to work on. So it's clearly outlined what needs to be done. So strengthening the anti-corruption and bribery legal framework is one of the four things that IMF has identified. The procurement legal framework and the transparency around procurement, for example, for a long time, one of the key commitments under the IMF program is to publish all procurement contracts. And to this date, it had a deadline in 2023, but to this date, Sri Lankan government has not done so. And to have a lot more transparency around tax exemptions, right? And a lot more transparent asset declarations, not just for politicians, but even for senior government officials. So there is there are 16 priority actions that the IMF governance diagnostic has listed down as critical. And one among them is exactly what I told you about the sugar scam, right? How important it is to repeal all laws that allows politicians to change taxes without parliament oversight, right? Because this is basically so enablers of corruption to be tackled. I think it is critical for AKD government to prioritize those actions and recommendations made already, and it is expected because under the IMF program, the expectation is the findings of the IMF diagnostic assessment will be converted into a government action plan with timelines for implementation.
Thank you, Shivashini. May I now turn to Dilini? And of course, you spent some time on the Adani Wind Power project and the impact, the of a potential cancellation of the project might have in relations with India, given also the fact that the background of AKD also has, I think, New Delhi somewhat worried, although publicly they haven't been saying so, of course. So could I just ask you to shed some light on, you talked about the new cabinet having decided to reconsider the Adani project, and of course they've also gone before the Sri Lankan Supreme Court. What do you actually, if you kind of sort of do a little bit of crystal ball gazing, what do you think the new government might actually do? What does reconsider mean? Does it mean outright cancellation, or is it sort of hedging their bets?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Actually, that's the one point that I really wanted to highlight, because reconsider doesn't mean that it's going to be necessarily cancelled. So, and one option could be outright cancel. The next option would be to address the current allegation against this project, like awarding the contract, as Subhashini mentioned, because one of the main allegation is a procedural irregularities, because it has been awarded to our Adani without calling for opening competitive biddings, because this is a project that should come under the Government General Procurement Guidelines 1998. So it was based on the unsolicited proposal, but according to the guidelines, even though it is an unsolicited proposal, the government cannot make decisions exclusively based on these unsolicited proposals. So that is one thing. Then perhaps the second option could be reconsider, could be think about like rectifying what is the current problems, especially one of the main problems that has been raised in this fundamental right petition is this cabinet approval has been granted before the Central Environment Authority has finalized or given their approval to the environmental impact assessment. So perhaps the next option could be to reconsider, would be mean for the new cabinet to rectify those issues and continue with the project, perhaps renegotiating the terms or the MOU that they have been already entered into. And according to my research, there has been not an investment contract has been not finalized. So it's a decision to allow the Adani to enter into a contract to develop and operate this project and to power purchase from this project. So I don't think that if I go back to his original promise, so perhaps reconsidering could be interpreted as outright cancellation. But when it comes to the geopolitical challenges and considerations, perhaps it could be mean to reconsider the project and rectify these allegations and then continue with the project. And when it comes to continue with the project, it's very important to understand that this is not a project that the Sri Lankan government has been called for applications, because it's an unsolicited proposal that has been entertained by the former Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration. So then there is a question whether, because if you look at the political manifesto of the AKD, it's very clearly say that we need to attract foreign investment which aligns with the national priorities and development strategies. And there is a question whether how this government could consider and how they understand these unsolicited proposals, whether it's aligned with our national priorities and development strategies. So in that sense, I think that it could be varied between the outright cancellation or perhaps due to these other geopolitical considerations, continue with the project while addressing the present allegation against it. So we have to wait and see.
Right. Thank you. That's a very sort of nice clarification of what reconsider might mean. So may I now turn to Rajni and have a couple of questions for before I turn to the audience questions. One is you mentioned that in your presentation that the NPP is a big tent party. So I assume it'll sort of carry along other smaller groups or parties that are not exactly of the same ideological bent of mind. Could you sort of elaborate a little bit on that and how sort of this big tent philosophy of the NPP, how would that also translate into, say, specific policies like I believe during the campaign there was a lot of talk, of course, about the IMF bailout, and AKD had things to say about that. So, for instance, how do you see the NPP negotiating, this IMF bailout, given its, prior ideological sort of framework or commitments?
Yes, Ranil. I mean, the word victent is interesting because on the one hand, as we mentioned before, that the NPP is an alliance of small groups, associations, and parties, of which the main party is the Janata Vimukti Peramuna, so the JVP. But I think it can also be fairly argued that it is perhaps the only significant political party within this grouping of smaller bodies and such. And in the lead up to the elections, as well as according to the discourse right now, the NPP has been explicitly against the idea of forming any alliance with any of the mainstream political parties on this argument that they were part of kind of a 76-year curse of Sri Lanka, where of a political culture that had been extremely, corrupt and rotten, and that the NPP was representing something very a significant break from this old political culture. So what I'm trying to say here is that the NPP, in being Big Tent, it was closed off to this idea of forming alliances with other parties. And whether it is able to pragmatically continue to do that, of course, the general election results will determine that. But in terms of ideology, certainly the NPP had this element of attempting to appeal on the one hand to business communities and more liberal sentiments, as well as, of course, at its core, it has always had the more left ideological discourse. And then when it comes to, of course, demographics as well, moving beyond its more traditional working class, kind of far left supporters, the NPP was this time able to be quite diverse in terms of appealing to very diverse demographic groups, with the exception of, as we mentioned, perhaps the Northern Tamil vote. And this was a question that we had in the lead up to the elections as well. When you are ideologically so diverse, how does that translate once you're in government? And it's, of course, too early to tell because it's only been 3 weeks, and also because it's the lead up to general elections. And so a lot of what the government is doing at the moment appear to be a lot of surface level, more addressed towards the anti-corruption promise. But even as Subhashini said, even that at a certain level rather than at a most structural, deep-rooted level. But even right now, Roger, I think we see that the criticisms of the NPP are emerging on these grounds. So, for example, within the main opposition party, the SJB, one of their main criticisms is that the NPP in the lead up to the elections promised to renegotiate the DSA. And they also promised certain public sector salary hikes. But after coming into power, there has so far not been much indication in terms of renegotiating the IMF. So we do hear that discourse on the one hand. On the other hand, in the early policy decisions of the NPP government, we did see, like Dhirini mentioned, kind of reviving the Adani wind power project, whereas during the election campaign, it said it would cancel it. There was also this statement that privatization of the Sri Lankan airlines would not go ahead as it had been under the previous government. And so I think that perhaps we can read this as the NPP trying on the one hand to appeal to these diverse groups of constituencies that it was trying to appeal to, and trying to play that balancing game in government. But of course, I'm sure that the limits of it will be seen very soon.
Right. Thanks for that clarification. And I'll turn in a moment to the questions that are coming in. But before I do so, I have just a quick follow-up question for Rajini. You talked about, of course, the others are willing, are more than, I'm more than happy if you step into. You had a point about the new constitution. Could you sort of shed some light on what that might entail? Are there any sort of contours that have been discussed, or is it too early to say what the new constitution is all about or might be all about?
Yeah, it's a bit early to say, Roger. I'm happy if the others join too. From what we have seen beyond the kind of ambiguous discourse by the NPP so far, there have been, I think, some indications of a new electoral system. there has also been some discourse in terms of power devolution of the existing 13th Amendment and provincial council system, even though the NPP had said that they were kind of aligned with the idea of continuing with the PC system. A lot of the discourse was that the existing solutions to the ethnic question were inadequate and that you needed to come up with a kind of more structural solution to that issue. So assuming that a new constitution will also have these clauses that address the issue of power devolution. So power devolution, the electoral system. Besides that, I think it's a lot of speculation.
Right. Of course, they need a 2/3 majority to.
Yes, exactly.
Subhashini or Dilini, did you have any?
Just to say, they've been discussing about abolishing executive presidency as well, right, Dilini? Because again, that has been a continuous demand, and also from an election promise, like Dilini said, that was never kept by multiple candidates in the past as well. So they've said they are also interested in abolishing the executive presidency and wanted support of the other parties to do so.
Right.
So I also agree with the Subhashini's point that would be a very crucial issue if we're going to have a new constitution.
Right. Yeah. Okay, we'll follow that space closely. But now we have a few questions that have come in. So one is on tourism, which is, of course, a major pillar of the Sri Lankan economy and is just recovering. The question is, will a new leftist president/PM and a general election yet to play out? What is the prospect for the new tourism strategy, like development such as integrated resorts with casino, etc.? Any thoughts on that, on a new tourism policy?
I personally feel among the issues that AKD might have challenges in reconciling their past answers and ideology with the proposed reforms, tourism would not necessarily be a priority. I personally feel promoting tourism and supporting tourism would remain critical, because I think there was a follow-up question there also, which I can relate to, because somebody said outside IMF, what are the core economic issues? And this is where I would say you would largely support tourism, simply because one of the key issues that AKD government, whether it's debt sustainability or revenue enhancement, needs to work on is stimulating growth. So Sri Lankan economy has contracted, right? Actually, our real economy is currently at 2015 levels. So there is a clear, signals of the importance of doing reforms to stimulate growth. And I know IMF and others have been talking a lot about trade liberalization, investment liberalization. In my view, actually, it is trade facilitation and investment facilitation that is inhibiting growth more so than the liberalization. And those facilitation is difficult to address simply because, again, coming back to corruption, right? So IMF also has recognized high levels of corruption at customs. So that is why I say tourism would not be one that would have face serious issues with the AKD government. One might argue state-owned enterprise reforms might face challenges, but not the tourism sector. I wouldn't say it will face serious issues.
Right. Thanks, Subhashini. Did any of the other speakers have any intervention regarding either tourism or the next question, which Subhashini already referred to, some of the key domestic issues that need to be addressed? Of course, some of you already talked about some of the key issues that need to be addressed. Anything to add, either Rajini or Dilini, on that issue?
I didn't have any further comments.
Maybe, Roger, just a few words on, we did mention quite a bit on terms of the government's mandate. The economic issue, of course, is the most primary right now, obviously. And then also this mandate to clean up governance and to change the political culture. But a third issue is, of course, and related, of course, to political culture, is the issue of accountability. So we have seen the new government providing assurances of providing justice and accountability with regard to the Easter Sunday attacks that happened in 2019. And while these political will and assurances are seen as promising, there are also concerns whether the government would be as forthcoming when it comes to issues of justice related to the alleged war crimes during the final stages of the war, and then also in the post-war human rights violations. And so I think that's probably a challenge for the government going forward as well, in terms of having to, on the one hand, keep with the key Sinhala Buddhist majority constituencies, but then also at the same time to respond to the pressures that are being exerted on Sri Lanka, especially in venues such as the UNHRC.
Right. So there's another question which probably might be directed more towards Rajni. So the question is, despite the election promises, it seems AKD is following what's being done by RW. So we now into acronyms, which was done by Ranil Wickremesinghe so far. How do you think this will be viewed by the general public?
This is hard. Subhashini or Dilli, do you have a better answer on this? I have to think about it a little bit.
I think that definitely is where, just like this what Delini said about cancelling to reconsidering, the idea is how do you even on the IMF package and IMF agreement, from renegotiating to, so people definitely expect something different, right? So how do you tweak and how do you show that somehow we are different? So what we see from now, like Rajni said, they're not thinking of any radical changes. They understand, in my view, AKD up to election and after election has appeared very pragmatic in dealing with economic issues. And one of the pragmatisms that I see is him even retaining the central bank governor and the secretary of the treasury. Sometimes these positions change with election change because the governor and the secretary of the treasury has continued to be the two pillars that has been involved in the IMF program, debt restructuring, all of that. So it is. So I think it will be very interesting to see what he can do in terms of the IMF program to show that somehow his approach is different. This is where he had continuously emphasized relief to the poor as one of the core areas that he want to, sort of rethink within the IMF program. And there is also, in IMF program, you have two things that you can work on. One is the IMF targets, right? Whether it's revenue targets, fiscal targets, all of these things, they are largely fixed. And I think attaining them is critical for the recovery. But the part where he may have flexibility in showing difference is the methods through which he achieves the targets, right? And this is where he has to be very strategic in showing that he cares more about the way in which these targets are achieved, which is a concern that public had, the manner in which these targets are achieved and this idea that they have somehow been captured by vested interests at the cost of public interest. So I think it is definitely a tricky one because people expect him to be different and he has to show he's doing something different. But how he will navigate that path will be interesting to see.
Right.
Yeah, just to add what Subhashini
Go
said,
ahead.
I think it is going to be very, as you said, people expect a lot of different things from him, but I think it's too early for us to judge because it has been just on into the office. And in this line, it would be very important to say that when it comes to trade and investment, whether this AKD government want to continue with the Economic Transformation Act that has been taken as a part of the IMF program. So it is too early to discuss or to predict or give a definite answer to what extent he is going to follow this path that has been already started by the Wickremesinghe administration. But there will be certain points that he wanted to deviate from it. But in my opinion, it's too early to give a conclusive answer for that.
Right. So it is the sort of proverbial honeymoon period, but it's going to be a very short one, I think, as is the case with a lot of new regimes. So, Rajini, if you don't have anything to add right now, there's another question. This might be directed more towards Vashini. I think the question is on how practical it will be for AKD to give more reliefs, such as reduction of PAY VAT, etc. And I guess how is going to bridge the revenue gap if he does so. Any thoughts on that? I think you're on mute, Vashini.
I will quickly show a slide that I wanted to show because we are talking about AKD. I wanted to say Sri Lanka's problem with IMF programs is not uniquely a AKD problem, right? So we've had 16 programs. This is the 17th program, and many of these programs have not completed. I think it's very important to understand while we may think this is a uniquely AKD problem, actually every previous government has faced the same problem, and on revenue targets, right? So since 2000, we've been in 3 IMF programs. This is the 4th one. And what this shows is, and every IMF program recognized revenue as a critical problem Sri Lanka needs to fix. Sri Lankan revenue has been declining. And what you see here is none of these IMF programs, right? And they achieve the revenue targets assigned. So IMF program itself says this program is the revenue targets as very ambitious, right? For example, we are expecting in the next couple of years to reach 15% of GDP in revenue. And if you look at these graphs, you can see like we had about 15% before 2007, right? We've never achieved it. So you could see, regardless of whether it's AKD, RW, or anybody, that is very difficult. So within this context, managing these expectations is what is very challenging, and how you can communicate to the people with credibility about the challenges and constraints remains critical, because only hope is that he has learned by the blunders of the previous regimes, because there is no room for excess in the current economic environment. And if he tries to push, what will happen is we'll go spiral into another economic crisis. And that will be the end of, to me, again, his party or his chances of remaining in power or coming to power in the future. So since his political life is also at stake on these things, I think it is a careful balancing. But where I see he can still balance and win public credibility is really paying more attention to governance and corruption vulnerabilities and fixing those loopholes where public will see him in positive light. And every previous government has failed to do that. So that is where I feel if he does more, if he shows he's doing a lot more on governance and corruption, maybe he can get certain compromises on not delivering as much as expected in the economic front.
Right. Anyone else with any thoughts on that question? Revenue gap, or Subhashini gave a fairly comprehensive answer. Okay, if not, there are some questions that have come to me directly through the chat mode. One is again on the IMF's governance diagnostic, I think, on which Shini has already talked quite a bit, so I'll skip that. So there's a question again on the Adani, the wind power project, and the question is, how would this decision? Of course, the decision is, as Dilini mentioned, we don't yet know what exactly the decision will be, but how will a potential decision affect Sri Lanka's broader investment climate, particularly with respect to balancing Chinese and Indian projects? What strategies should Sri Lanka adopt to navigate the geopolitical tensions between the two major powers? Of course, this is a much larger question which goes beyond just this project. Dilini, you want to sort of maybe...
Yeah, because
Yes,
as we said, that is, still we cannot exactly say what whether its decision going to be the outright canceling or it's going to be reconsider and continue with the project while rectifying the or addressing those allegations. But when it comes to these investment projects, Indian investment project, you have been saying that there's one important aspect when it comes to the recent Indian investment in Sri Lanka, because most of them have been challenged as a fundamental right violations by the citizens. So if that court is going to cancel this project, or suspend its project. So that provides some leeway for the government to come up with a strong justification saying that, look, it is not a political decision. It was a court has decided to cancel this project and we have to abide by the decision. So this has been shown in the recent case where the VSF e-scam, the e-visa problem, where it was easy for this new government to back to the earlier system because the court very clearly suspend the new scheme of issuing e-visa, and then the minister very clearly say that we are going to abide by the Supreme Court decision and the interim order that suspend the new scheme, and we're going to restore the previous one. So in there, you can say that like where the court is providing some sort of decisions to cancel project, it would provide them a legal justification to cancel the project. So it is something that they can easily navigate this problem because they can say that it is not a political decision, it was a legal decision by the Supreme Court where we have to abide by, and they have been always say that we going to abide by the decision of the Supreme Court, because given that there are certain instances where the RW government, he was criticizing and not following the decision by the Supreme Court. Of course, when it comes to this e-visa project as well, so the top regulator was charged with the attempt to contempt of the court because he's not following the interim order received by the Supreme Court. So that is one way of they can navigate this problem without getting to the political realm, keeping it within the realm of law and saying that it was cancelled by the court and we're going to abide by decision. But there, apart from these kind of things that they can navigate this problem, I think it's better to, there should be a very careful balance between how they bring about these expected political reforms at the home, at the internal level, and how to manage with the broader geopolitical considerations associated with them. So it's going to be challenging, and that's where, and I very clearly mentioned this is one of the challenge after this election, because expectations are high and a lot of promises were given. But when it comes to the implementation, not only the geopolitical challenges, perhaps they could associate it with legal challenges as well, because most of this investment are already, some have given the contract. So under this contract, there might be arbitration clauses where Sri Lanka has to face with the legal responsibility. So those kind of things are involving in this. It is very important for this administration to carefully navigate these things, but it's going to be tricky and challenging.
And regarding the sort of the larger question which you addressed, partially on navigating the geopolitical tensions between the two major powers, that is India and China. So are there also any Chinese projects that have sort of figured in the recent election discourse?
Yeah, I think in this election, it was the major focus was not the Chinese investment. Chinese investment was at the focus when it was 2015, like all these Chinese investment funded by loans or investment. And among the foreign investments, the major problem, the major focus was at the disputed Chinese Colombo Port City project. But in this scenario, after this 2015 and later on, now we see that there are a lot of Indian investments in Sri Lanka. So, for example, there is the oil tank in Trincomalee has been agreed to develop as a joint venture. And also, very recently, it was reported that the Mattala International Airport's operation and management has been leased to a consortium with the Indian and Russian consortium. It's a joint venture. And also, it was very critical. Of course, the Adani was very critical, as well as the Adani's, the other project in the Colombo port. So all these things, when it comes to the post 2015, the most focal point was Indian investment, but at the same time, they were considered by the public rather than as a the question was for the public was whether they are real foreign investment or foreign influence in the context of this broader geopolitical games. Geopolitical rivalry between the great powers, the regional powers. So in that sense, I think if your question is, of course, in this election, rather than the Chinese investment, it was Indian investment was at the focus, and it has been already argued that some commentators that through this increased investment in Indian investment in Sri Lanka is going to be a virtual province of India. So on the other hand, it has been argued that Sri Lankan should be welcome these projects because India's good money is invested in Sri Lanka's bad economy. So these are still we have to look at in this end, but two arguments are going. Some are treated Indian investment in Sri Lanka with great suspicion, while some say that even though you are a cash-strapped economy, a lot of Indian investment are coming. Again, it throws back to the question, what is the real motive of this investment? Whether they are policy-driven or whether they are profit-driven. So that's a question that we have to navigate through this geopolitical changes that is happening in the region.
Right. That's a very good summary of the challenges, geopolitical challenges being faced by Sri Lanka. If
Can
any...
I add one?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Question? So one of the things that I've also looked quite a lot at procurement and the foreign finance projects. One of the things that I clearly say for any Sri Lankan government that wants to navigate geopolitics, they need to really have a proper procurement framework where competitive bidding, a process of transparent and competitive bidding becomes the norm, not the exception. Unfortunately, where we are talking about all of these unsolicited proposals by the Chinese and by the Indian and also by some others as well, is a lot to do with because Sri Lanka does not have a proper procurement framework. We have cabinet approved guidelines, and Sri Lankan cabinet have always misused their discretion provided to them within these guidelines. So going back to your question about also what needs to be done in the corruption governance. So this fixing this procurement framework is not only important to support Sri Lankan recovery, but in my view, it is also critical for Sri Lanka to navigate the tense geopolitical environment with the growing rivalry and competition between India and China in the Indian Ocean region.
So I totally agree with your point, Subhashini. It's totally agree with because we have seen that even in the past, there are certain Chinese investments. Chinese companies was not happy with this procurement process was not followed when it comes to certain projects. So I totally agree with point that having a proper procurement framework in place, because we don't still have a law. It's all our guidelines and manual. So it is very important for we to have a proper regulatory framework on this should navigate this journey and make it transparent. All the projects are awarded in a transparent manner.
Right. Thanks for those interventions. If Rajni doesn't have anything to add, we're running out of time. So there's a sort of a general question that's been posed, which some of you already addressed, but maybe that might be a nice way to sort of sum up the discussion, end the discussion. So the question is, given the interplay of economic challenges, foreign investment pressures, and political fragmentation, what do you think are the top 3 priorities for the new government to stabilize the country and to restore public confidence? Of course, this is a large question, but maybe each of you can maybe, come up with 1 or 2 top priorities, and that might be one good way to sort of end the discussion. So shall I start with Subhashini maybe?
I think one of the key priorities, of course, is macroeconomic stability. We need to make sure that Sri Lanka's exchange rates, inflation, interest rate, and the macroeconomic environment is stable. The second one is, in my view, stimulating growth. Here, I focus quite a lot on reducing the cost of trading across borders and cost of investing in Sri Lanka. And while AKD government may have reservations ideologically or may have a cautious and conservative approach towards liberalization, I don't see any reason why they should shy away from facilitation and cutting red tape and making the business environment more efficient. And that is one of the critical constraints of the why we are not getting the investments and why Sri Lanka's exports are stagnating. Thirdly, I think relief to the poor. It is very critical that our social safety nets are well funded and properly targeted. We've taken some steps by introducing Aswasuma, which is definitely a better program than the previous Samurti program, but I think there is quite a lot of work to be done in that area.
Right. Thank you. And may I now ask Dilini, do you have any response to the sort of top priorities?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the investment, as we discussed, proper legal framework should be in place. And apart from that, I strongly believe that the Sri Lanka really need a national policy on investments. What actually we need, because the previous regimes, we have seen that most of these foreign investment are perhaps they're based on their personal political agendas, and the question was whether they were political necessity or the economic requirements or the economic necessity. When it says projects, when we're deciding, because especially when it comes to the Rajapaksa administration, there was a lot of allegation that most of the projects were not designed based on the economic necessity, but rather than a political priority to make their regime very, very visible to the general public. So I think it's very, very important for us to, if they want to navigate these geopolitical challenges which we face in terms of foreign investment, it's very important for us to have a clear national priorities and strategies about what kind of investment we need and what are the sectors in which we really need investment, before just without just keep the practicing of entertaining unsolicited proposals without following their procurement process. So my top priority is to having a very clear national policy on foreign investment, identifying what are the sectors in which we need foreign investment.
Thank you, Dilini. May I now turn to finally to Rajni?
Yes. Just a few words, Roger. I mean, in terms of priorities, possibly this issue of political legitimacy, and that's really broad. But I mean, I seriously see this as, of course, the biggest challenge. And so therefore, it should be the biggest priority of the current government, which is this idea of how do you maintain legitimacy in such a difficult economic time. But as we said, like how do you ensure buy-in from these various sections of the population in Sri Lanka? And this can, I mean, include, of course, the economical marginalized sections of the population that are feeling the brunt of the reforms. But also alongside with that, we see, the current government promising a more inclusive, representative political system. How do we make sure that certain sections of the population, especially the minority sections of the population, feel that they have a degree of ownership and belonging within the new political space that the current government is creating? I think that should probably be the biggest priority for the government.
Thank you, Rajni. And since we run out of time, I'm afraid we'll have to call it an end here. Thank you to all the panelists for an invigorating discussion on a question that is very complex and something that ISAS will closely continue to track, and hopefully we can meet once again, after the November 14th election results are announced, to sort of reassess where we stand with regard to Sri Lanka. So thank you. Maybe have a virtual round of applause for the speakers, and thank you too for the audience for attending and for asking interesting questions. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.